Woolley. Welcome to this presentation. We're going to talk today about the anatomy of construction defects. So as we do that, we're going to go through a few housekeeping items. First of all, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm the president of Defects Solutions and the founder. And I've been in the, as you can see from the screen, I've been in the industry just a couple of years. And as we talked earlier, you learned a little bit more about me. Defects specifically is a consulting and advisement company that works with people in the home building industry. So we work with builders, trade contractors, attorneys, engineers, architects, and those who have a vested interest and stake in the industry that we all participate in. And we do all kinds of training, education. This is one of those education models that we do. A little bit of housekeeping. If you haven't, take out your phone, put it on mute or vibrate. If you need to leave, please do. The facilities are just down the hall. And we'd appreciate it if your phones didn't make a lot of racket in the class. I do have one rule. If your phone goes off, you have to stand up on your chair and you have to dance to the tune. Okay, now from the smiles, I can see a couple of you probably have some pretty wild phone tunes. So just to go ahead and be willing to do that. And lastly, as we're talking today, this needs to be interactive. I can stand up here and talk for hours and hours. Just ask my wife or Dennis, who know me well. But it's more interesting if you participate. If you have something to add, a story, a question, when it comes to mind, I've got the cheat sheets, I've got the PowerPoint, so I can get right back on track and it won't bother me. But I always appreciate your involvement, so feel free to talk about it. With that, let's begin part one. What constitutes a defect? Let's start with that. It's a good question. Chantel, I'm going to pick on you. What is a defect in your mind? And there are no wrong answers.
There's something that doesn't work properly.
Okay. Would we all agree with that? What else could a defect be? And why are defects so scary in our business? Brad, you probably deal with them once in a while in your role.
Sometimes they just look bad.
Okay.
But in all reality, the ones like Chantel said, the ones that don't perform well, cost us a lot of money sometimes.
Great point. They end up costing a lot of money. We're going to talk about both those elements today because there's a lot to defects. When I look at this picture, I always go, whoa. You can see that very clearly. What is wrong with this picture? What are you seeing here that just as an individual involved in the building industry kind of comes to mind real quickly? Soils report. Good. I like that. Was there even a soils report, number one? And two, did they follow the engineer specifications? Okay. Good point. What else? When I first saw this site, I'm one of those as I'm driving on vacation, my wife will say, stop, turn around, you got to take a picture of that. This was a little 2-lane Highway 1 in Northern California, no place to pull over, so we went down about a mile and a half, turned around, came back, and I found a little turnout, pulled in, got out, pulled out my camera, and there were 3 homes that had actually just collapsed into the ocean over time. I was there 3 years later, as it happens to be a place, I'm originally from Northern California, so it's a place we go to quite often. And when we were there, you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 homes that were still standing. Of those 5, 2 were actually shuttered and considered uninhabitable. Now, there's only 2, so another one in 3 years has now become uninhabitable, and the only last 2 can anyone dwell in. So it's only a matter of time before, obviously, that collapses. Now, is that a defect? Certainly so. The question is, what caused it? What could have done to prevent it? And who's going to pay for it? Obviously, an insurance company in this case is going to pay some pretty big dollars to some people who built some homes in an area. And then what will come to bear, and we're going to talk about that risk management that builders, developers, and us in the industry have. What risk and what portion of risk do we have when things go wrong like this? I can guarantee you an insurance company will pay after a long, bitter battle, but at some point there will be others that pay as well, depending on different statutes in different states. What happened here? This is in Utah.
No compaction.
No compaction, or at the very least, very little. Go ahead.
The runoff.
Runoff, lack of retention, on and on and on. A lot of issues. This was only one spot at this particular residence that was having major issues. And it was one of those homes that was built in the peak when everything was just going crazy. And then obviously they weren't able to sell it because it dropped and the market values went down. And so it sat for a couple of years. You can tell that from the weeds that have been whacked off. They're pretty thick and chunky. And then now the bank says, well, let's bring this back to life. Let's try to sell this place. And so I was asked to go in and look at it. And there were a number of things that we saw that were problematic. And let's end with this one. What's wrong with this? Nice toilet. Yeah, yeah. Defect? All in favor, raise your hand if it's a defect. If you're not sure, kind of drop your hand to here. A couple not sure.
Buy a different toilet seat, right?
Okay. I had to take a picture of this. I was actually at a business meeting uptown and walked into an office that had been recently renovated. So the bathrooms were new tile, new fixtures, etc. And I opened up the stall door and I went, you've got to be kidding me. I have to take a picture of this. Now, I've used this picture for a couple of years now in my presentations. What do you think the first thing is mentioned that's a defect? The number one item that's usually mentioned.
It's too close to the wall.
Too close to the wall. Exactly. It actually is within an eighth. It's okay. It's just barely there, about an eighth of an inch. Which surprisingly with the new tile, it did work. But we're okay. But it's close because it looks that way because this is a handicap stall, so it kind of gives the appearance of being too close. But very, very close. So that's a great call, Chantel. What do you think the number two item is that people say, well, that's a defect?
Toilet seat doesn't match.
Toilet seat doesn't match. Actually, that's usually number three, Brad. But that is the issue. Usually they say, well, the tile, it's from a different batch. It doesn't match. And actually, the picture doesn't do the tile justice. It looks a lot better in real life, although they could have done a little better job blending the tiles. And we can only suspect that they all came from the same batch. Hopefully that's the case. But the toilet seat, is that a defect?
If it's a handicap stall, it's not a handicap toilet.
Okay. Good point. Here's what a defect is. When you end up in litigation, a defect is going to be defined just as it is in the dictionary. It's an imperfection that impairs worth or utility. Okay, did that impair the utility of the toilet? No? You can still use it. It's not quite meeting code. That's another issue, but that certainly is a defect because it doesn't meet code. So that's one strike against it.
Elongated toilet, but you don't have elongated seats, so you reduce the usefulness of it.
You could make that argument, but the biggest issue actually, other than the code, is the worth. Now, if you were to buy this building, what would you do? You'd change the toilet seats. If you manage this building, what would you do? I went and found the manager. I said, I got a question. So I looked in the other bathrooms, and I snuck in the women's and said, anybody in here? And I checked them all out. And every one of them had this toilet seat, which told me, Mike, who blew it? Either purchasing or the installer. Maybe he didn't have the right seats, picked up the wrong, seats, and he was there and he said, I got to get this job finished today because someone's pushing me. Brad or one of your superintendents is saying, get this done today. I'll come back later. Well, forgot to come back, and so you've got the wrong toilet seat. So yes, it impairs the worth, and you could make the point possibly into the utility side, but specifically utility side if you bring the code into it. And we'll talk about codes later today. Any of you familiar with Jim Collins, the author? Have you read his book, Good to Great? I recommend it highly. It's really a great business read. It's fairly thick, and there's a lot of wonderful information. And the basic premise is Jim did a lot of research looking at companies that were good in their specific industry, who then moved over a period of time to something that was very, very great. And as he talks about the different elements that cause companies to go from good to great, and isn't that what we all want our companies to be? Is if we're not good now to become good, and if we're good now to become better. One of the premises that he talks about is it's really just that simple. The things that we need to do to become great isn't rocket science. It's pretty basic stuff. But because it's so simple, we miss it. We overlook the obvious, and that's what makes it very difficult. And that applies very well today to what we're talking about here with construction defects. Because on the surface, sometimes we say, it's just overwhelming. How do I do this? Years ago, I was hired by a company to come in to oversee, and I was a role similar to yours, Brad, to be the construction manager and to oversee 7 superintendents and to fix their warranty department. So when I came in, I said, how big is the problem? And I knew the owners very well, and they said, well, we think, that's the first clue, we think we have probably an average, and they were building 75 homes a year, custom high-end homes. They said, we think we have probably about 15 to 20 items per home that are in the 12-month warranty period that we need to resolve. And we're not comfortable with that, but we are spending a lot more money. And nationally at the time, the average that you would calculate in a very well-run business would be about 0.5%, no more, for total warranty and items after the close of the sales price. So take the sales price, 0.5% of that, and that's what you need to budget to take care of that. And most of us are going to say, yeah, that's a pretty good number. And if we can stick around that number consistently, we're doing very, very well. Well, they were about 1.5 to 1.58% of sales price. So they were way out of whack. And they knew they were spending too much money, but they didn't know how to get their arms around it. So I was tasked with my staff of saying, how big is the problem? Let's get our arms around it. So we dug into it, and we found out that not only did we have 15 to 20, but if you take the homes, just closed to 1 year, and the 1 year point to the 2 year point, and the 2 year point to the 3 year point, we had thousands upon thousands of punch list items. Some very minor, some just cosmetic, as we talked about earlier, some very major. And some were in some stage of being repaired, and others hadn't even been touched at. We had customers that were furious. People would come into the subdivision, new buyers, new potential that we'd spent money on to get them there, and they would be talking, to the people who were already there, and they would say, oh man, these guys just don't take care of business. What did that do to our sales? Obviously, it affected them drastically. As we dug into that, we realized that we averaged about 75 items, 75 to 78 items per home if you took that 3 year window of homes, 225 homes. That's a lot of work to be done. So what we did was we devised a plan, and we said, okay, we're going to start taking care of everything from day one. We're going to try to stop the bleeding, figure out what's causing the problem, and we looked at consistencies, things that were happening on every house or on multiple houses frequently, and we resolved those, and we're going to talk about how to do that a little bit later in the presentation. That was step one. Step two was we said, we got to get caught up here. So then we said, the best PR move we can do is go clear to the end and work backwards. So we're working from both ends to the middle. And intuitively, it just felt right, so that's what we did. What was interesting is within 3 months of making that step forward, all of a sudden the PR problems went away. We still had issues, and we still had a lot of undone work. But the people on this end were talking to the people here, and the people here were talking to the people in the middle, and they were patient, knowing that we were doing something as a company. And as we communicated that to them, they believed us for the first time. Partially because we had some new staff, myself included, but more importantly because our clients, our customers, were sharing the good news, the message, and saying, hey, it's getting better. They're taking care of this. You'll get taken care of too. And they believed it. When we finished that exercise, it took us about 9.5 months. That's a long time in our industry. We put a lot of resources to it and involved all of our trade partners and really got everyone engaged. At the end of the day, within a year of that point in time, we had dropped from 1.5 to 1.625% of sales cost to less than 0.5% and got it back in line with where it needed to be. Did we have a lot of defects after that point? No, because a lot of them just simply went away.